In order to save something to Firebase, we are going to save them in different collections. So if we go to our Firebase here, under the database, you see that the top level, it says start collection. So this is how we can create a collection from here. We are going to give it an ID. So imagine this like our database here, one folder, and the first level of collection is a main folder for each category. So we are going to have different big folders here, and they are called collection. In Firebase, it goes this way. You have a collection, then you have a data inside the collection, and then you have another collection, another data row. So this is the way they separate the files. Once we start writing some information to database, you will see visually how it looks like. But for now, just imagine that we are creating top level folders inside our database. And in order to write something to our database, we need to get access to the link where our top layer folders are. So I'm going to create a function that is going to return our top layer folder names. So we are getting the path depending on what the path we want. So let's say we want to get the users. This function will give us the path to that user top level folder. Then we have different top level folders. For example, we want one for channels, we want one for messages, we want one for the recent chats, etc. So I'm going to create a new file, and it's gonna be a Swift file, and let's call this f collection reference. And here we are going to import our Firebase. And let's create a function and call this Firebase Reference. And this will take a parameter. Let's call it the name of each top level folder we want, so the name of the section. So it's going to take a collection reference, which is a string, and it's going to return something, and it's going to return collection reference. The collection reference is a Firebase provided class. Jump to it. And this is just a link to specific folder, specific collection inside our Firebase dictionary. So in order to make things easier, this collection reference, apart from string, we are going to create a special enum with all the different categories of our top label folders. So let's create an enum, and we call this f collection reference. And this is just a string, so we tell that this is a string, and we have different cases. So let's case user, and I'm going to call this user. Then we have case recent, for example. And for now we have two cases. We are going to add extra once we get there. And all I'm going to change is here, instead of we are saying just we want to pass a string here, we are going to pass something more specific. We are going to pass an f collection reference, which is on its turn, it's a string. So it's easier for us to work with these enums. We just add any top level folders we have here. But for the return, I'm going to say return, and we're going to access our Firebase, which is our Firestore. We're going to initialize it. Then we want to access a collection. And then for the collection, we just get this and get the row value. So we provide whatever the name of our collection is that we are passing, in our case, we have a recent or user, two cases for now. So using this, we can access to a top level folders. And now I'm going to, let's put everything related to Firebase in a separate folder. So right click, new collection from selection. I'm going to call this Firebase helpers. And let's take this out from our model and put on top of it. So there's another folder here, right? So we have this nice helper function that will provide us with different level of folders. We can command P just to make sure everything is built. And what I want to do now is to create some functions that will help us to register or to log in our user. So let's create some specific functions for our users. Oops. So command N. Let's go to new Swift file, call this Firebase user listener. And this function I'm going to create so we can put all these nice, all these nice functions that are related to Firebase and user listening. So we are going to download users, save user to Firestore, login, register, change the user, etc. So I'm going to import Firebase and let's create a class. It's going to be Firebase user listener. And this is not subclass of any other class. I'm going to create a static let shared is equals to our Firebase user listener, and this way we are going to create a singleton of our class. So we are going to initialize it only one object of the specific class, and say private init, and we're going to just initialize and return. We're not going to pass any initialization here. So this way, every time we want to access our Firebase user listener, we should say Firebase user listener dot shared, and this is going to return our singleton Firebase user listener object. And let's put some marks here. We call this a login part, and then we want to have also register. All right, so we are going to begin with our registration function, because since we have no users, we cannot test if the login is working. So the registration function is going to be called func register user with, and then we pass our email, which is a string, and the password, which happens to be string as well. And what we are interested in is when our registration is completed, we need to be informed that it was successful or no. And since anything related to Firebase is happening on a background thread, because it has to connect to server, get some information, save something there and get back to us, all this information is happening on a background thread. So our main thread where the UI is, nothing is blocked until on the background we are trying to register the user. So what we need to do is a way to be informed once some task on a background thread is completed. And this is where our completion handlers come. They are going to inform us once some tasks are finished. So let's pass a completion handler here. I'm going to write completion and say at escaping. And we're going to get some information back. So what we want to get back is our error, which is a type of error. It's an optional. and this doesn't return anything, so we say void. So this part is like a separate function which will be called once our background thread is finished. So we call our completion and tell that, hey, here is your whatever we have here. In our case, it's an error. So say here is your error that we have received with from the fact that we were trying to create a user object. And pay attention, the error is an optional. So it may be a nil if everything went according to plan and we registered a user object. The error will be nil. Otherwise, if there was something bad going to happen, we are going to receive an error from Firebase, and this error we can pass straight to the function that called us. So in our callback here, all these things will happen in our function. I'm going to actually, before we can call our completion, we need to register a user. So in order to register a user, we are going to access the authenticator. So we say auth, and we initialize the authenticator, and then we say we want to create a user with email, and the email we can pass our email, and the password will be our password. And you see this function has its own completion handler, because everything this function does is creates a user which happens on a background thread. So once I click return on this, it will give me two options to call my variable. The first one is auth data result, authentication data result, and error. Both of them are optional. So I'm going to call this auth data result and error. So this is what this function will give us. So what we are interested in, as soon as we get the information back, I want to notify whoever called this register user through my own completion handler. So I will say completion, and let's pass the whatever error we have received here. So this will notify our caller function. And then what we want to do also, we want to check if error is equals to nil. It means everything was successful and we registered our user. What we want to do is to send a verification email to that user, so he can go to his email address and verify his email. So let's say auth data result, and we can unwrap this because we just checked that there is no error. It means we have received authentication data result. And then we access the user object, and then we are going to tell our user object to send verification email, and this has a completion handler option. And I'm going to just hit enter, and one more time enter, and it has a callback of error. So all we are going to do is here is a print, and I'm going to say auth email sent with error, and in case there was an error, let's pass it here. We'll say error localized description. If there was no error, we are going to print out in console auth email sent error, and then it will be a nil, this part. So I'm going to put a note here called this send verification email, and this is what the part will just do to send the verification email. Apart from sending a verification email, we want to create a user object. Remember, the authenticator is creating a user inside our authenticator part here. So we'll get an identifier, a user ID, and the method it was signed in. But what we want to do is to have our own custom user objects here. So in order to create a custom user object, this is the very best time to do that. So I'm going to let's put a note, create user, and save it. So let's say if auth data result dot user is not equals to nil. So we have a user object. What we want to do is to get the ID of this user, because in our Firebase, once the user is created, it has a unique ID that each user receives. And this ID is unique for our application. So there are no two same IDs. And we want to use that to create our custom user object. So I'm going to create a user. So I said let user is equals to user, our custom user class. And we are going to create one with ID. And the ID is going to be our auth data result dot, let's call this auth data result. And we can unwrap this. Then we say dot user dot UID. And this is what we receive from Firebase. We get this unique ID of our user and we pass it in order to initialize our own custom user. The username, I'm going to pass my email here that we have received on top here. The email is also going to be our email. Don't worry about this username being an email because our user has an option to change its username anytime he wants. The push ID, we are going to just pass a empty string because at the registration level, we don't have any push ID. Avatar link, again, we are going to pass an empty string, and status, at this point, we are just going to say, hey there, let's put this, I'm using Messenger, or anything you want as the default title of default status of our user. Right, once we have the user object, what we want to do is to save this user object in our local database, which is locally we're going to save it actually in user defaults. If I go to my user object here, remember this current user thing is getting our current user from user defaults, but right now we don't have any way of saving it into our user defaults. So let's create a function that is going to do just that, to save a user object to user defaults. I'm going to place it in my user Swift, but it's totally outside of our struct. So I'm just positioning it in this file. So I'm going to call this func save user locally. And it's gonna take a user object and it's going to save it into our user defaults. And in order to save anything to user defaults, we'll have to convert it to simple values. So you cannot take any custom object and save it to user defaults. So we can save straight away some simple values like string, integer, data. This is what we are allowed to save into user defaults. So what we are going to do is to encode this to be a dictionary using Json Encoder. So let's say let encoder is equals to Json Encoder. And this function is going to take our user object, convert it to JSON data, and save it into our user defaults. So I'm going to say encoder dot encode, and then it will take some value to encode. And pay attention that this function may throw an error. So what we want to do is to put this into do catch block. So if there is an error, we will be notified. So I will put do and catch. And then we are taking this and putting into our do, and I'm going to say let data is equals, and we're going to try to encode our user. So we say encoder, encode, and then we pass our user object. And the reason we can encode this, because our user object conforms to codable protocol. Gives us an opportunity to take our user object and convert it to JSON using our Json encoder. Once we get access to the data, then we can say user defaults so say user default dot standard, and then we want to set data, and what we want to set is data for key, and the key is going to be k current user. So we take whatever we have converted and we are going to set this for the key k current user, and to catch it we are going to say print. I'm going to print error saving user locally, and let's print our error. So error localized description. So this function is going to take the user object that we have created, convert it to JSON, and save it to our user defaults for the key current user.